Good evening, Dr. Michael Fisher. It's really a night to celebrate in many ways in a world that's quite dark, and many of us are aware of that impending sense of dread, cascading crises of all kinds. Don't need to all be all mentioned and listed once more. Um, the celebration is really that I'm interested in leadership, and this is part of the political leadership part of me speaking tonight on behalf of really the planet. Um, shall I be so arrogant to assume such a position? I do so with great respect and humility as well, in that I could speak from my position and perspective, but I also speak as a being created by creation for a reason. And my focus tonight is going to be on a leader. There's a leader among us. There have been many great and interesting creative leaders among us. There have been many that have succeeded, many that have failed, many that are not so great of leaders for all kinds of reasons. That's part of the podcast tonight. But the focus is on particularly one leader amongst us that is emerging, and I have been following for several years, written a book about them, and I will introduce them through a slide PowerPoint presentation very shortly. Wanted to start with the celebration in terms of a gift. And the gift is part of a gratitude practice that many people are practicing. And certainly our ancient ancestors have practiced gratitude as knowing that it is a challenge and a difficulty to live as a living being on a planet like Earth in a cosmos that is so vast and so amazing. And yet there's some reason that we do feel we are here. And so groups create ethics of gratitude, practices of gratitude, rituals, ceremony. And that's a little bit how I want to start very briefly. And I'm going to be reading from a book from a colleague of mine, Dr. Four Arrows, Darshia Narvaez. His colleague have written a book on comparing the two worldviews, a kinship worldview of our ancient ancestors, what we also call the indigenous traditions, and the more dominant culture, more familiar to us as the colonizing worldview, the dominant worldview. Comparing those two worldviews, in some sense, they are opposites. In another sense, as Four Arrows likes to say, nothing is opposite from an indigenous perspective. Yet the indigenous perspective is unique. Here's one set of code of ethics or guidance system for really us tonight. It's a gift from the indigenous people's tradition. 1, daily sanctification and expression of gratitude. 2, respect for all life through honoring and esteeming others, including non-humans. 3, respect the tribal council. 4, truthful at all times. 5, extraordinary hospitality to guests. 6, empathize with others and understand the spirit of the whole. 7, receive with strangers with a loving heart. 8, understand that all races are family members, beautiful creatures of the Creator. 9, serving others is the meaning of life. 9, that was 9 and 10, moderation and balance in all affairs. 11, understand what leads to destruction or to well-being. And last, 12, follow the guidance given to the heart by dreams, prayers, solitude, and wise others. Let me go to the PowerPoint to introduce really the co-presenter with me tonight. So I'll share my screen. Marianne Williamson is someone who I've followed. I mentioned earlier, a leader among us. I've been watching her blog. You can just look at this expression for a moment while I'm speaking and introducing her very briefly, because I have done many videos on her. You can check my YouTube channel. This is an expression of a person recently from a talk with Jeff Krasno on his podcast called Commune. And I grabbed that shot because it just seemed to represent so much to me of a person who has lived a long life. She's the same age as I am, entering 71 in the next year. Lived her practice of both spiritual development, inner development, and the political practice of how do you put that into the world in a living way, in a good way. She ran for Democratic leader in the 2020 race for President of the United States under the Democratic ticket and did not quite make it through the early part of the primaries and dropped out of the race. In those 2 years since that dropping out in 2020, I've watched carefully what is she going to do next. Well, she says she spent, in this interview, she spent, a good year forgiving herself for the errors she feels she made during that campaign. She also spent that year forgiving others for the way they treated her in a spirit of meanness, often from even her own Democratic side, which she found vicious at times. This is somebody who ran the campaign trail with full force, amazing energy in this person, Marianne, and with a following that she knew was going to be tricky. It was going to be hard to negotiate how to work with the mainstream of the Democratic Party, how it was going to work with the general public, with her coming from the positions that she comes from. I will not overview all of her platform, both politically, spiritually, but she does say America needs a revolution, and that's what I stand for as I come and speak before you. She spoke that wherever she could. She tried to be sensitive and committed to really those kinds of ethical principles that I just read. I totally see that in her work. And I watched her. What is she going to do in these next few years? The by-elections in the United States just finishing. She's got a chance now to really think seriously. And in that interview on October 22nd with Jeff, she really comes out because he pushes her. What are you going to do about what the state of the world? I'll get to that in the last part of this video. Some of the aspects from that wonderful conversation, a very frank one. I enjoyed some of the nuances of how Jeff was probing to get Marianne to make a commitment, perhaps. Are you going to run again in 2024? Again, however she decides to run, whether that will be as a Democrat or whether independent or however she is in consideration. I knew she was in consideration. So when I say the last 2 years, I've watched carefully what is she going to do, because I just finished my book on her and the presidential phenomenon, the Marianne Williamson presidential phenomenon. If you want to look that book up, my summary of the whole campaign of her kind of life and her intellectual life, her spiritual life, her political life. But what I kept noticing is that she decided to go into public media. She started as a podcaster. Many people have done that who are interested in politics and really thought leaders who want to have an impact on society. Educator that she is, a great adult educator. I speak of often in my writing about her. What I noticed is that in the last few months, since July, she was on a speaking tour internationally, even came to Canada up here where I am, and even in Vancouver. She did quite a long speaking tour in this last part of the summer and into early fall. Now she's not doing her Apple podcast since July. I wonder why she isn't interviewing more people since the last time she started it, right after her run for the 2020 election. She started that Apple podcast, interviewing all kinds of interesting folks that she really wanted to promote and put out into the public. She did over 56 podcasts in those 2 years. A very dedicated woman, and those are well-researched podcasts. She interviews very well and interviews people very well. Well, okay, so why did this stop? She's not doing any more Apple podcasts. She went on this long, big tour internationally, and now she's coming around, and I finally caught this is the first interview I know of any extent and depth. It was an hour and 20 minutes or so. And okay, I got a good flavor for where she's coming from. So you had a chance to see her now, get a feeling of my context for her. This is really my sitting here in Canada. How am I going to be involved? So when Jeff asks her, well, what are you going to do about it? I really feel his question was coming to me just as Marianne's question comes to all of us. She really would turn around and say, what are we all going to do about it? What are we going to do about what we're not happy about in the society, in politics itself, in the world? Where are we going in the future? And what's really important? What's very important? And this is a serious decision, she says, to whether I should run or not. At one point in the talk with Jeff, he mentions Gabor Mate. Gabor Mate is the Canadian medical doctor, well steeped and well, known. He's now got a best-selling book out, The Myth of the Normal. He's an expert on trauma and historical trauma and many other things, but particularly, he's well known for his work on addictions on the East Side in Vancouver as a medical doctor and an activist. Here's a quote from his latest book, The Myth of Normal, which I had to get and see why is this now a bestseller on the New York book list. Here's a quote near the last few pages. He says, "How can we possibly disassemble such a vast agglomeration of culturally manufactured misperceptions? They all derive from the core principles of this book." So these are his suggestions, how to deal with these misperceptions of society, the myth of normal. He calls it a biopsychosocial medicine is what we need. Another word for that, folks, and it will become the word tonight for Marianne Williamson, a holistic approach. Then he says we need to see disease of all kinds, physical to spiritual and mental disease, as a teacher. The next offering he makes, the primacy of both attachment and authenticity. Attachment being that deep psychological connection to others that obviously starts with the mother and moves therefore from the womb to the tomb. What is our attachments and how do we live a life of authenticity? And there's his existentialist speaking. And above all, and I underlined in yellow, highlighted, because, oh, was I ever happy to see this in the last few pages as I scanned. We require a fearless self-inquiry for the self to do this work and on a social scale. So gratitudes to Gabor Mate, Marianne Williamson, and Jeff both acknowledge their appreciation of Gabor Mate and his work and what he's presenting for us today to look at the effects of trauma on everything we do, from the psychological to the political to the spiritual, as I said. Marianne Williamson has interviewed Gabor Mate a few times in her own podcasts, and they are very respectful friends, you could say, and colleagues. My last part of this slide really is to show that I think the shift for Marianne, and this is my recommendation for her and her followers, her advisors, and for all of us really, to think about this next American election in 2024, a very crucial election, just like the 2020 election that, yes, Biden won, but this election, we also know the Democrats could lose. We also know that Donald Trump has now, just as within this last week, thrown in his official cap for his MAGA intervention, his saving of America. He is running for president for 2024. We are in for a very intense time, and the decisions and processes of what goes on are going to be very, very important. So let's get back to that interview, Jeff and Marianne. There's one place they're talking about when Marianne was first thinking about running for 2020. She really felt in her heart that she had to step up. Um, she had run a little bit in politics, a little bit. It's an important one, in the 2016 elections for a Congress position in California. Um, Came in quite well, but she didn't win. And then by 2020 rolling around and all the dynamics going on, she just said, I have to do this. This I'm being called to. This is what my heart speaks. I'm very excited about it. But she said, I got to check out and talk to somebody. So she went and talked to Tom Hartman, who's a well-known broadcaster, podcaster in the US, has a really huge following and has been in politics and events of the American culture for a long time in the world. And she talked to him, and he basically said, well, that's great, Marianne. I'm really glad you're happy. It'll be an interesting if you run, but I just want to fill you in on here's the realities of the things you're going to face when you get there, when you run. And those were really all the roadblocks to the way the society works, the norms, right? The myth of the normal, those perceptions, and what Gabor Mate might call a lot of them are misperceptions due to trauma, to wounded people, to fearful, terrified people who make all kinds of perceptions about reality and how they treat others, not within that ethics as I read out, and are quite unethical in their practices. And he just said, be prepared for all of it. It will come at you. And she gulped, and she says in the interview with Jeff, and I decided it was still in my heart to run. So she did. She says at one point in the interview with Jeff, incredibly exciting time. I know I probably could do it again. I'm not sure I'm going to. I'm still in the process of deciding, but I want to let you know it's brutal. I didn't know it would be that brutal. She says, I will not be that naive the second time going in. What she mostly, I believe, as I've watched and analyzed the situation, she, I believe, was let down, not by her enemies, not by the people who were sort of neutral in how they responded to her. And she won a lot of people over, not just from her own community, her circles of what you might call the progressives. She isn't afraid to use that term for her own self-identity. But she was really wanting to bring all of America together, to unite under this new revolution, politics of love, she called it. Title of her last book, A Guide for the Politics of Love. She really felt let down, and I believe she still has maybe either not acknowledged it fully, or she just doesn't want to go there in public discourse in sharing too much about how she was let down by her major players who are very influential people around her and that are in part of this spiritual, call it the wellness community, the holistic community, the health and healing communities, and spiritual communities, as I say, that she really felt there was a large contingent of progressive community in those circles, identified by those labels, that just did not come forth fully. And that would be with funding that she required and support and backup. Consistently ongoing, be there when I need you. I'm pretty sure that was a major factor of her disappointment and where she really had to forgive people. She's now saying, as they move into the last part of the interview, and I picked up at point 58 minutes. I will put a link to this interview so you can watch it yourself if you wish. 58 minutes and 30 seconds. When he says, so what are you going to do about it? This is after they analyze all the problems still in America. And she's really giving the very same speeches that I heard in the interview with Jeff. I hear many of the same lines that she used during the 20 run, and that she's been using for years, really decades in many cases. And she's really saying that, what are you going to do about it? She answers, and I'll quote her, I'm going to ask people like you and others that I know. And that is, would they be with me this time? Now, There it is. I picked it up, I think. This is my interpretation, of course. See, will you be with me this time? And then she actually says to Jeff, no, you were with me. Don't take that personally. Yeah. Well, maybe he was, and maybe he wasn't as much as she would have liked. I don't know. They know that. But Jeff is very supportive of her. She says, but I do feel that our community, and she's referring to those communities I just identified, let's call them holistic, brings the whole person, quoting her, and brings a holistic perspective. And she says that no other candidate she knows of. Yes, she loves Bernie. She's okay with Elizabeth Warren running if they both run and get there. To also run for president again. But she says they're not, she's literally saying implicitly they're not holistic in the way she is. In that sense, they're not as radical as she, for sure. And she says, I can't imagine how they treat me. She's talking about really the Democratic National Congress or Convention people committee, how they treat me if they thought I was a real threat this time. In other words, if she did really have the backup, the new backup, more support, got further on her run as a Democrat leader, if she chooses to go that way, or if she goes as an independent, be more of a threat perhaps. Either way, she is basically saying, whoa, she takes a breath and she says, they treated me pretty bad, running as part of their team in the way that she was part of their team, the Democrats. If she comes in at even a more independent angle, continues her, and I suspect she will continue very much with her same campaign, more or less, and just build on the success she had the first time, which she did have good success. She says, I'm not naive about that, ending that quote. And she's just knowing she may be more of a threat a second time around with a growing greater force. And if we step up, the people she's asking to support her, and I'm going to put myself forward tonight as one of the Canadians, and perhaps with people like Gabor Mate and perhaps many others that we can bring from Canada to actually support her too. That's why the two flags at the bottom of that slide I just showed, this ought to be, the 2024 election ought to be an international affair. Sure, it's American politics, and you go, well, that's just Americans. I'm not American, and why should I care? But yeah. There's one reason, at least. There's many reasons, but one that I really picked up from her talk of why we all ought to care. All us who are dedicated to the improvement of humanity in some way, no matter what our walk of life, layperson, professional, leader. And she says, Jeff asked her, well, how would you change, the referent criteria for what makes a good, successful society? And how can we put that forward into public policy and help shape public policy from that ethical standpoint of this is really important for a successful society? And he asked her, what would that top one be? And she said, well, I think it might be climate change. And then she says, but even before climate change and environmental issues, the most fundamental one, and here's where she grabs the heart of the educator in me, the father in me. We have to have a new reference criteria for the primary importance of all things that show a successful society, which is the state of our children. Yeah. I just spent yesterday with my partner, Dr. Barbara Bickle, artist, researcher, educator. We work together often. She's been my partner for 33 years. And we spent the whole day, half a day, sorry, in the forest with a group of 10 children, 3 to 5 year olds, with their 3 caregivers, educators from the care center where I volunteer and sometimes work both as an artist and as a HR person for that organization. And the incredible importance of being with 3 to 5 year olds and just hang out with them for 2.5 hours as we did, um, in the forest, and playing and learning together, and using arts-based approaches as we did, and the use of nature as the fundamental classroom environment, if you will, for everything we did. And when Marianne Williamson said that in the interview with Jeff, the state of children is more important than everything else. We will fail at everything else if we do not look after that number one and be motivated by that number one. And from that motivation, you can just hear it's like the mother, right? And she is a mother, Marianne, she's a daughter, well grown up now, of course. That's where you move forward in a society. So in that sense, her politics is a politics of love and maternality, the maternal as primary. And this is the revolution. She's really bringing forth the politics. This is what makes, to me, her a holistic, relational-based, ethical leader. There's really no more words I could keep repeating about why I think she's important, why I want you out there to check her out in the next while, and to think of this international connection of their country and Canada and other nations that want to join in. And we'll have to think. I'm going to be thinking very creatively, and look forward to your ideas as well, how to bring a support for her. Everything I heard, and let me just go to the last part of my notes when she was speaking, I could hear her basically saying, I am thinking very seriously of running. I can see she is going to run. I can feel it in her presence. I could feel it in that picture I took of the still from the talk with Jeff. She is going to do it. I am aware that there's lots of problems with that. No matter which way she goes, I don't think is that important. She may make it out to be important. I hope she doesn't, and I hope her followers don't say it's that important. Even if you repeat, Marianne, speaking to you now, and your followers, your supporters, your advisors, what you brought forth in that time period you were in the running for the 2020 leadership. And that's through all your presentations. It's through who you are as a person. It's how you present yourself, what you stand for. Really is what I would say a great holistic human being. We just do not have those options. We do not see them enough. Sure, people will react to them. People will hate that. That's just the surface. What they hate to see is what they've left behind. You remind them of that. That'll happen for great leaders. I know myself, as I've been a leader, as I study and work with leaders, and I'm an advisor to so many leaders in different ways. But what you represent is what we need, many, if not all, human beings subconsciously need to see. You said it yourself, Marianne, in the interview. You said something like, we all know in the subconscious what it is that's wrong, what it is we're missing. And we recognize when we see it in the subconscious. So in many ways, that's what I'm asking you to focus on. An international support network for you running to support this raising of consciousness, part of your revolution, politics of love. Whatever words, you even called it politics of enlightenment, which I thought was very brave of you in that talk with Jeff. You need to know you are supported and will be supported this time in a very different way. Reason is because you poked through and you got as far as you did. People saw that. It's got memory now. You have a memory track within the cultural subconscious and the collective historical conscious of everything in that holistic movement you represent, from those indigenous traditions and ethics and practices, embodying that. You have an amazing force coming with you. So yes, as she says, I have to watch my ego doesn't lead me to want to go back in and fight again. And she says that. So she knows, and it will be challenging because I've critiqued her several times in my book and other places on videos where I think she loses it. She gets in her ego, personality, smaller self. But the essence of what I'm saying as I end this video is you're on it. We're on it. The holistic movement is on it. We will come forth in a new collaboration this time like never before. I wish you the best. Good night.